So Professor Nyasha Junior, Dr. Nyasha Junior, is an assistant professor of Hebrew Bible in the Department of Religion at Temple University in Philadelphia. She holds a PhD in Old Testament from the Princeton Theological Seminary. Her research and teaching focus, right, on the intersections of race, gender, and religion. She is the author of an introduction to Womanist Biblical Interpretation. I believe there's a copy of that sitting right there. With a cover art by my wonderful partner, Kim Wilson. And her current research is on the biblical character Hagar and interpretations of Hagar throughout history. And this is under contract with Oxford University Press. Dr. Junior writes for both academic and general audiences at a variety of media outlets. Visit NyashaJunior.com and follow her on Twitter at, anybody want to guess? Nyasha Junior. Today, Professor Junior is going to speak to us on the subject of Beyoncé, Black women, and the Bible, and I would like you to join me in welcoming her. That this event is co-sponsored, this is important, by the Departments of Africana Studies, Women's and Gender Studies, and is also sponsored by a generous gift from our Dean, Cindy Vito. I knew I was going to forget something. I'm so sorry. Now I will shut up and let you go.
So we'll start over. So good evening. Thank you to the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies and the Africana Studies program, as well as the Women and Gender Studies program. And thank you to the Dean as well for her support of the program. A special thanks to Dr. Kazarian for inviting me to be with you today. So if you happen to be live tweeting, my Twitter handle is Nyasha Junior, and all of the things related to the book that I'm going to be talking about are under the hashtag IntroWBI. I normally live tweet everything that I go to, except I can't live tweet my own talks because I'm doing the talking. So I will check Twitter after this, and if you want to talk there, we can. So today we're talking about Beyoncé, Black women, and the Bible. And as Dr. Kazarian said, I'll talk for a little while, but I'll stop in between and ask if everybody's sort of with me, but I'll also leave time at the end for Q&A, and we can talk about this project, which in fact is not a work in progress, but is already done. But my new work is still very in progress. So this is the project that I wanted to talk about. So we can talk about this, or we can talk about what's upcoming for me. So today, a lot of what I'm presenting comes from my book, An Introduction to Womanist Biblical Interpretation. It's my first book, and it was just published in November. So it's still fairly new. You should buy it. Ask the bookstore to carry it. Make sure that it's in the library. We're going to talk about Womanist Biblical Interpretation, which some of you might not have heard of before, and we're going to take kind of a circuitous route to get there. And of course, we will start with Beyoncé. So we'll start with Beyoncé, and then we'll talk a little bit about terminology, and then we'll talk about how that all relates to biblical studies, okay? All right, so first is Queen Bee, Beyoncé herself. I don't think that she needs an introduction. But there may be some in the room who are perhaps not familiar with her work. So, just in case you didn't know, Beyoncé Giselle Knowles Carter is an American icon and a global phenomenon. She is a singer-songwriter and a native of Houston, Texas. She was the lead singer of Grammy Award-winning Destiny's Child. Anybody remember Destiny's Child? Okay, all right, yes. And she is now a Grammy Award-winning solo artist. She's also an actress and one of the most successful and influential artists in the 21st century. She happens to be married to Sean Carter, who is also known as Jay-Z, who is himself a musician, artist, rapper, businessman. And she is the mother of Blue Ivy Carter here, who is on her own already an icon. As an entertainer, she's frequently on stage, in videos, and in the public eye in glamorous, and some would call them provocative outfits. She has a number of different songs that emphasize party life, good times, hits such as Drunken Love, Pretty Hurts, Sex Kitten, Run the World, Upgrade You, Freakum Dress. Some of you are familiar with these. For her music, her outfits, and her sexiness, she has often been criticized in the media, in part for not providing what some feel is an appropriate role model, for not providing a positive and wholesome portrait of a wife and mother, in fact. Beyoncé is sometimes in outfits such as these, and this is not perhaps as provocative as you think it is, as this is not in fact her, but it is placed over her so that it looks like she's in fact completely nude, although she isn't. And this kind of thing gets a lot of people in the press very anxious about who she is and how she's portraying herself. People who are policing her as a woman, as a wife, as a mother, and what does this all mean? Is this positive? Is this positive for Black women, in fact? At the start of this tour, she was interviewed for British Vogue in 2013 and asked if she considered herself to be a feminist. This is often a question that comes up, especially for women in the public eye, women who are celebrities or women who are politicians. Any woman in front of a camera at some point is going to be asked, are you a feminist? It has become almost a litmus test kind of question. And Beyoncé stated, I don't know, that word can be very extreme, but I guess I am a modern day feminist. I do believe in equality and that we have a ways to go. And it's something that is pushed aside and something that we have been conditioned to accept, but I'm happily married. I love my husband. So Beyoncé, along with other celebrities and other women in the public eye, is often asked about her politics and asked about specifically this notion of being a feminist. Later on, she actually sampled Adichie's TED Talk on feminism in her song Flawless. In it, she explains a feminist is a person who believes in the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes. And, as you may know, at the MTV Video Music Awards, she appeared with feminist behind her as what many understood to be her statement, very clearly and unequivocally stating that she herself was a feminist and was in support of feminism. This kind of questioning about Beyoncé, and none of us is Beyoncé. We understand that we are none of us worthy to even be considered like Beyoncé. However, one of the things that it brings up is often the ways in which Black women especially are questioned about their being feminists, about their understandings of themselves, their own identities, and their politics. So Black women, for quite some time now, have been questioned about, are you more Black or are you more woman? Which side are you really on? And for centuries, Black women have said, I'm both and, that I'm a woman as well as a Black person, and I'm not one before the other. Because in saying so, I'm acknowledging that I'm both of those things at the same time, and I can't separate them one from another. Feminism is difficult to define, but in general terms, it's about the support for and action directed towards elimination of women's subordination and equality of men and women. When we're talking about first wave feminism, anybody had some women gender studies classes, first wave? Ring a bell? Okay. So basically, first wave is a way for 20th century people to talk about things that happened in the 19th century related to feminism. And so it's not that the first wave people in the 19th century ever called themselves first wave, but it's a way that later people could combine the work that they were doing and put it into a trajectory that's longer term to understand what other people were doing as part of a first wave. So it's sort of like, did you guys see Creed? Okay, so like Creed is really following from Rocky. And so Creed really makes sense if you've seen Rocky. But Rocky wasn't ever called Rocky 1. There's just a Rocky 2 after that. So there's really Rocky 2 and Rockies before that, but no Rocky 1. So it's the same sort of thing. Like there wasn't a first wave when people were doing it, but later people called it that. When we're talking about first wave, the things that we talk about now with Black women as being Black or women were also issues then. So for example, there were questions about, should Black women really be focusing on abolition? Because that's just Black folks. The white women were focusing on women's equality, but in doing so, they were really talking about white women. So Black women have always been at the center of these kinds of controversies, and Beyoncé, I'm arguing, is just one of the latest examples of that. So where we see this clearly is in the title of an award-winning edited volume, All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, But Some of Us Are Brave. This is an edited volume in 1982 by Gloria Hull, Patricia Bell Scott, and Barbara Smith. And this for me really helps you to understand the difficulties that Black women have faced about being both and about having these competing groups asking for their time and effort and energy. So with the term feminist comes other questions about other terminology. So in the 19th century, most people who were women's activists weren't calling themselves feminists, although they might have been doing work that was supporting women's equality. A lot of times that work was the work that was identified as supporting white women and particularly white affluent women. The work that Black women were doing in support of Black women, Black families, and Black men is oftentimes in the historical record not regarded as the same kind of feminist work, but looked at as more, well, Black stuff. So even when they were operating on behalf of Black women and helping to do things that are on behalf of Black people, in understanding that work historically, it usually was shelved with the Black stuff. So along comes Alice Walker. Alice Walker, you know who Alice Walker is, right? Yes, okay. So Alice Walker is a Pulitzer Prize winning writer, and she is responsible for her 1983 collection of essays called In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. And she defines the term womanist in the front matter of her book. And I have copies for you of the definition when we're done. In this, she doesn't actually coin the term womanist, which existed as a term, but she redefines the term in a creative 4-part description that highlights the roots of this term in African American culture. So the lengthy definition is often condensed down to a couple of phrases from her definition, one of which is a womanist is a Black feminist or a feminist of color. Another often quoted phrase from the definition is the analogy, womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. So Walker emphasizes a number of different things in her lengthy definition, but it's often collapsed to just those couple of phrases. So after Walker's term comes out in '83, there were a number of Black women who began to identify themselves as womanists and use that term to explain who they were, how they operated, and also they used it within their own scholarship. So some people called themselves Black feminists, some Black women call themselves womanists, womanists of color. There are lots of ways that you could identify, some of which related to feminism and some were choosing to use a separate term, womanism. In part, the use of a separate term was to distinguish themselves from feminism, which oftentimes, again, tended to focus on the efforts of white women, larger organizations, large-scale groups, larger fundraising, and not really dealing with on-the-ground issues that people were facing. It doesn't mean that there weren't Black women who weren't feminist or who were part of feminist organizations, but there were some women who wanted something different, something special, and something unique to separate what they were doing and how they understood themselves differently than using the term feminist. So the term womanist, again, was one of several options for people to use, but the term womanist became quite popular, so much so that there's often an assumption, even in academia, that any black woman you see, automatically you assume that she identifies herself as a womanist, or certainly as a black feminist. That isn't the case, but the term has become frequently used such that this is an assumption that comes out a great deal. Within the academy, it's difficult to make generalizations about what womanist approaches are within scholarship because people use the term in a lot of different ways. So feminist approaches can be used within lots of different fields. Some of the things that you might do if you're using a feminist approach, it depends on the field, but you might be focusing on gender issues, you might be looking at gender, you might be looking at gender as well as other factors. You might be looking at women who were pioneers in your field and reclaiming their history. So there are a lot of different ways that you could be using that term. For womanist approaches, there are also similarly lots of different ways that one might do that. So part of the variety of ways that people might use womanist approaches would include critiquing feminism, critiquing a focus solely on gender, looking at interlocking oppression, so looking at not just gender, but gender, race, class, sexuality, disability, and other factors, and also focusing on the lived experiences of African American women. So there are lots of different ways that you could use feminist approaches in your scholarship. There are also lots of different ways that you could use womanist approaches in your scholarship. One of the issues that becomes really apparent quite clearly, though, however, is that the uses of feminist approaches usually don't involve an assumption that the person doing the work identifies herself only as a feminist. So by that I mean you can use feminist approaches and you may or may not identify yourself personally as a feminist. It depends. But if you're doing womanist work, one of the key assumptions and one of the key things that seems to be foundational is that the work has to be done by a black woman. So there are men who do feminist studies, there are men who do women and gender studies. No one seems to blink an eye about this. But within womanist work, because of the way that the term has been used, there are particular ways in which this has been carved out as a significant way that only black women, to my knowledge, have been the ones to identify their work using this kind of approach. That becomes problematic when we're talking about the growth and development of approach, if it means that only certain people can do it. So when we're talking about feminist approaches, again, there are men who do feminist approaches. It's not about the person, but it's about the way that the person is interrogating his or her subject. With womanist approaches, particularly within biblical studies that I'm going to talk about, it becomes an issue if it means that there's a precondition that you have to be a thing in order to do the thing. There are some people who think that's a great idea because, you know, we don't want them stealing our stuff anyway. But it means that there are hindrances in how much that field can grow and develop if you have to be a thing in order to do a thing. One of the other things related to womanist approaches is the notion of intersectionality that's come up a great deal. Kimberly Crenshaw, who is an African-American legal scholar, is responsible for coining this term. And intersectionality refers to the ways in which categories of difference, gender, race, ethnicity, class, create what she calls mutually constructive positionalities or overlapping dimensions of experience. All that means is the stuff that we were talking about earlier when you're talking about 19th century women or Sojourner Truth saying, "Ain't I a woman?" I am both black and woman at the same time. You can't take those apart. And so intersectionality is a way of understanding that all of us have overlapping parts and pieces of our identities, and we understand that those identities are dealing with oppression in different ways. So one individual can be dealing with racism, sexism, and classism, and those things intersect with each other. So it's not an additive thing, so I'm a black woman and you add the two together. but black and woman go together and it's baked in that way. It's not that I'm one or the other. So for Crenshaw, again, this is coming from her work as a legal scholar and observing that there were ways in which clients could come forward with a gender discrimination case or a racial discrimination case. But when she had a group of black women, well, you need to pick. Are you coming with a gender case or a race case? Because we can't really handle both. We don't understand how that operates. We see this even in our current political climate, that there are people who talk about the black vote or the women vote, but by women they really mean white women, because they're not talking about black women together. So this notion of intersectionality deals with the issues of understanding race, gender, and class and their intersections. One of the problems with intersectionality is that sometimes people have started using this kind of terminology without acknowledging that it comes out of black feminist scholarship. So more recently in blogs and even on Twitter, I've started seeing people understanding themselves and identifying as intersectional feminists and not talking about how this material has developed out of the work of black feminist scholarship. So moving to what does this have to do with the Bible? So I'm a biblical scholar. I teach biblical studies. And usually when I tell people I teach in a religion department, they say, oh, you're a theologian. And I say, no, that's different. So my training is in biblical scholarship. And what that means is that my discipline is corpus focused. That means that we look at biblical text as well as comparative literature and material evidence. So we talk about the Bible, we talk about ancient Near Eastern literature, we talk about archaeology and stuff like that. So it's sort of like classics. You understand someone who does classics as doing a kind of body of work. That's what we do in biblical studies. But it's not the same thing as theology or ethics or even philosophy. So like when you go to the doctor, if you're going to see, let's say, a cardiologist, that's a person who will look at your heart. If you're having a baby, you want to see an obstetrician. Certainly your cardiologist probably did a 6-week rotation in obstetrics, but if you're delivering a baby, you want someone who's an expert in the thing that you're doing. It would all be nice if we had doctors who were concerned about the whole person and the whole body and all of that. But the way things are divided up into little sections. And so the section that you're dealing with, that's the person you go to as an expert. So for me in the religion department, there are other people that you talk to if you want to talk about theology and you want to talk about God and God's action in the world. My work as a biblical scholar means that I talk about God in the text. What God is doing in the things that we're reading, not the one out in the world. So within biblical studies, my work is on feminist and womanist biblical interpretation. But the way that that often comes across in a lot of the literature is feminist/womanist biblical interpretation. So what that means is feminist biblical interpretation has developed, if I say second wave feminism. There's also a body of work within biblical studies that was second wave feminist, where women were looking, in some instances for the first time with new eyes, to look at women characters in the Bible that people hadn't talked about. So if I say Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, ring a bell? Somebody, you heard of them, right? Okay. Yes, so most of the time when people were studying those texts, they didn't talk about the women. So for example, Sarah, they didn't talk about the matriarchs, they only talked about the patriarchs. They only talked about women as they were important to a man's story. They only talked about women as they were important in bringing about new life and continuing the line. So these were women who were doing really pioneering work in looking at early generations of women who had interpreted biblical text and looking at how women themselves had been interpreters of text in lots of different fields, looking at women characters and looking at issues of gender and power in very new ways. The slash is troubling because there wasn't the same amount of work being done in terms of womanist biblical interpretation because of the issue that I mentioned, that one of the preconditions for biblical studies with womanist approaches has been, well, you have to be a Black woman in order to do womanist work. And there aren't a whole lot of Black women who do biblical studies for various reasons. But it meant that when people were doing this slash thing, that it made it seem like there was just as much work going on in feminist and in womanist circles, that there was just as much scholarship, that there was just as much history and legacy of that type of work. So for me, after I finished my dissertation, which had nothing to do with Beyoncé, I was kind of wondering, so what do I do now? This is a typical problem for people after they finish their dissertation. Do you turn the dissertation into a book? Do you move on to a new project? What do you do? Also, I was dealing with some, post-dissertation PTSD, having come through all of that. And so for me, it really became, what do I actually want to say? What do I want to talk about, and what do I want my contribution to be? And one of the things that I was aware of was that in my field, there wasn't anything that talked about what this was and what some of the problems were and what some of the issues were and what maybe the future could be. So I decided to write the book in large part because there wasn't anything else out there like it. And I wanted to have materials for my own students and for other people who had students who were wondering, I don't understand this combination of words. I don't understand how this goes together. So I used to teach in a school of divinity with the students who were largely Master of Divinity students, and that's usually the degree that you take, especially for Protestants, if you're moving on to ministry to be ordained. And so a lot of the students were coming with lots of different majors who hadn't had women and gender studies courses, who didn't have that background, who didn't know what these words were, who hadn't heard of the kinds of people who were doing feminist and womanist work in other fields. So I wrote the book in part because I wanted those students to have a way to begin the conversation and to be able to jump in and find out more about these issues, even if they hadn't had these courses in their undergraduate years. So these days, if you're taking an MDiv, there's usually some kind of like Women in the Bible course or Women in Theology or something like that, even if they don't call it feminist. But I was concerned about the poor student who'd heard about womanism, who's been watching Beyoncé, who's been on Twitter, who's been on Tumblr, who's seeing the use of these terms and didn't really know how that was going to operationalize within biblical studies or within what they were doing in their program. So I actually hadn't studied much of this in my own program. What you find out after your dissertation is that then you have the opportunity to teach yourself all of the things that they didn't teach you. So it really was a process of me teaching myself the things that I wanted to know and trying to figure out how I could best communicate that to people who hadn't had the background that I had and people who might not have that background even in the classes that they were taking. So one of the first works within Womanist Biblical Interpretation is by Renita Weems, and it's called Just a Sister Away. And there's an update of her work, Just a Sister Away. In the first book, the subtitle was A Womanist Vision of Women's Relationships in the Bible. And this was one of the first works that used the notion of womanist within biblical studies. The thing is that Weems' book was more a popular book that was written for lay people, by which I mean just people who weren't experts, people who weren't clergy, people who weren't academics. So it was more kind of for people in the pew to talk about women's relationships in the Bible. And this was largely what most people were putting on their syllabus if they were teaching feminist theology or feminist ethics or other types of things, because there just wasn't a whole lot of work within biblical studies that was addressing these types of issues. So my book I thought of as a way to introduce these issues and to give people options for the types of things that they might include on their syllabus and the types of things that students might need access to. So as you know, you're a busy student, you have limited amount of time, you certainly have a limited amount of money, and if there are things that you need to know about, you want to find out, how can I find out about this efficiently? Certainly I know no one here is relying on Google and Wikipedia, but you want to find good sources of information that will help you to get where you need to go. And so part of, again, for me in writing the book is I wanted to provide students with a good, solid starting resource that gave them a lot of bibliography and not a lot of footnotes, but enough footnotes that you can get started on your research and to give you a place to go. So sometimes when you're starting a paper, you just don't even know where to begin. Like, it's a blank page, I don't know, the paper's due, let us hope not tomorrow. But you need something to get you going. And so that's why I wrote the book for the student who was wondering, I don't know how feminist and womanist and what this has to do with biblical studies or religious studies, how does that all go together? So the book that I wrote is about giving that student a place to begin the conversation. So writing it really came out of my own need, wishing I had had a book like this myself, and deciding that I would just have to write it and it would be for someone else. At this point, the impact of womanist biblical interpretation has been limited in part because there are so few Black women in biblical studies, and not all of them are doing this kind of work. So that's part of the issue about this notion of womanist is if it means you have to be a Black woman in order to do it, and there are some Black women who say yes and some Black women who say no, then not all of us want to do that. And so there are some Black folks who might want to still be in biblical studies and not do anything related to womanist work. One of the things that I discuss is when a term like this becomes so pervasive, what it means is that people start to make assumptions. And sometimes those can be people who are in positions of power. So if there's a job description for a professor, and it includes, we'd like to especially encourage candidates who do X, Y, Z and womanist work, someone who is on the fence might decide, maybe that's a key word and maybe that means I need to include that in my CV or on my cover letter. It also means that perhaps there are publishers, editors, who are looking for those key words and those key terms, and it unfortunately can be a way that people start to pigeonhole your work. Well, you're a Black woman, I assume that you must do work like this. I assume that you must do something like that. I assume you all sing and dance, right? No, you would never make that assumption. So you shouldn't make those same assumptions about someone's scholarship. You don't walk up to someone and say, I guess you're an engineer, right? You look like maybe you're an engineer. No, we don't make those kinds of assumptions because we assume that people can have lots of different types of interests. So one of the things that I discuss is there are ways in which the development of this kind of work is really powerful and extremely important, especially for Black women who have not had a large voice within academia. However, there can also be issues when people begin to make assumptions that you must do work like this, or you should be doing work like this, or there's a market for work like this, and funnels people into doing those types of things. So what I boil my work down to is basically the notion that while womanist biblical interpretation is relatively new in the development of academic biblical studies, meaning there haven't been a whole lot of Black women before Renita Weems in '89 with her work, Still, African American women are not newcomers to biblical interpretation. So what I talk about is before the terminology, people were doing the work. So before you had people identifying themselves as feminists, there were people who were doing work in support of greater women's equality. There were people who were trying to get suffrage for women, equal pay for women, all of those types of things before they had a name for it. Even after the name, there are still plenty of people who do that work but don't call themselves a particular thing. It works similarly with womanist work. Anna Julia Cooper never called herself a womanist. My grandmother never called herself a womanist. If you say, did you do work in support of the uplift of Black people? Yes, every day. Do you call yourself a womanist? I don't know what that is. So there's a way in which sometimes we get hung up on the term, and this brings us back around again to Beyoncé. We get hung up on what people call themselves, how people identify, what they put in their Twitter bios. But part of what we need to consider is the actual work that people are doing. So not just what you call yourself. So you can say, I'm an ally of queer people. Okay. Do you want a cookie for that? Do you want a sticker or a button or a t-shirt or something? What are you actually doing to support queer people? You can say, well, Black Lives Matter. Okay. Do Black Lives Matter on your syllabus? Do Black Lives Matter on your faculty? Do Black Lives Matter in the way that you spend funds at your university? So part of it is an issue of terminology. Not to suggest that terminology isn't important. Being able to name yourself, to label yourself, to claim space for yourself is absolutely important. But there's also a way in which we have to look beyond labels to what people are actually doing, not just talking about, but their action in support of particular work. So, again, my book is an introduction to Womanist Biblical Interpretation. And for me, it's been a joy to see the work live outside of my computer, where it lived for several years. And it's been really important for me to see it in people's hands, so much so that I even have a Pinterest board of people just holding their copies of the book, because for so long it was an idea I had, and for me it's been really special to see it actually live and out in the world. I haven't received reviews yet. Anyone who's written a book knows that that's really where the rubber meets the road. So I think people are still buying it and reading it at this point. I haven't gotten a lot of feedback back yet from people who are using it in larger context, but only from individual folks. But for me, it's been a joy to get it out, to have it live, and to, I'm hoping, make a contribution to especially students who are looking for a place to begin to understand the combination of words from Womanist Biblical Interpretation. So I have a handout for you that has some resources and also gives you Walker's definition. And the handout's also available on my website. It's the last blog post that I have. There's a Dropbox link if you don't get a copy.
Thank you very much, and thank you all.